The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Canada doesn't exactly share a border with Russia, but pretty close. Tonight, are we doing enough of the right things to ensure our security and sovereignty in the far north? First up, writer David Frum brings us the view from Washington ahead of the upcoming American midterm elections. It's Wednesday, November 2nd, and that's next on The Agenda. Next week, Americans go to the polls for what's known as their midterm elections. That is, at the midway point of the four-year presidential term. Voters could flip control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate from the Democrats to the Republicans if the polls we're seeing are accurate. What would that mean for Americans and for us? David Frum is a senior writer at The Atlantic magazine, and he joins us now from Washington, D.C. with more. And David, it's always great to have you on our airwaves. How are you managing these days?
Thank you so much. Glad to be back with you.
Let's set this up by saying we're going to talk about some pretty serious issues here. And notwithstanding, I want to start with a joke. Because you put something on Twitter the other day, the punchline of which is, he had a hat. And your suggestion is this is the he had a hat election. Go ahead. Tell the joke for those who don't know it, and then why you think that's relevant here.
The joke is that a woman is walking along the Strand with her grandson when suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge wave materializes and sweeps the boy out to sea. She's shocked. She's upset. It's beyond any human help. She falls to her knees and she prays and says, "Lord of the universe, I beseech you, return my grandson. If you do, I will keep all your mitzvot. I will give to charity. All I ask is that you return my grandson." Well, suddenly, out of nowhere again, there's another giant wave, and the boy is dropped on the beach, and he's sputtering and wet, but he's perfectly fine. And the woman turns toward the heavens and says, with a little anger in her voice, "He had a hat." So this is a classic Jewish joke about, we don't have a lot of gratitude for things. So the thing that inspired the joke was a report that showed that the American economy continues to grow strongly despite rising interest rates. Job creation remains strong. The labor market remains tight, not without problems, obviously. But the voter discontent is very intense out there. And so I describe this as the he had a hat election, that you would think that strong recovery after the COVID pandemic would be sufficient, but no, that people do have complaints. And one of the things that drives these non-presidential year elections in the United States is when there's a president on the ballot, 2020, 2016, 2024, voters have a choice. This person or that person, him or her. It's binary. Which do you like? In the non-presidential years, it's really more like a referendum on the question, got any complaints? And more often than not, voters have some complaints, and they take it out on the party of the president, and that's what's about to happen.
Why do you think these are, I guess, what are the prevailing theories behind why people are as ungrateful as some may be, that they think he had a hat, let's go? Yeah.
Well, so there is serious price inflation all through the developed world. Prices are rising faster than wages. People feel this because during COVID, a lot of consumers accumulated considerable savings. Many people continue to receive either a salary or else some kind of supplemental help from the government. Their expenditures dropped, and so they built up cushions of money, and that funded a lot of the consumption that ended up also fueling the inflation that we're all now suffering from. Well, those cash reserves are, for many people, gone. The inflation is outpacing wages, and having felt a little flush in 2020 and 2021, voters, especially in the United States, are feeling much less flush in 2022. So that's a grievance. It shows up very much in the price of housing. What has happened in the United States is with rising interest rates, remember, people finance new buyers typically about 80% of their houses, that you have effectively half as much purchasing power when you go into the housing market for the first time as the same amount of money gave you 2 years ago. So people don't like that. And it's not just first-time buyers, because in one of the previous peaks of the housing market was 2017. And the cheapest form of money you could get in 2017 was a mortgage that was fixed for 5 years and reset in the fifth year. That's 2022. So a lot of people who bought a house in 2022 and got a 2% mortgage are now facing 5 and 6% or worse mortgages in 2022 when the 5-year mortgage resets.
Let's go up to 30,000 feet and talk about a much bigger issue, a broader issue, and that is the state of democracy today. And I'll pluck a line out of your recent Atlantic piece here where you say voters are not much preoccupied by threats to democracy. This is a very troubling development. Why do you suppose they aren't?
People, and I include myself, and we should include both of ourselves in this. We're human beings. We are, of course, completely consumed with our personal and immediate problems. It's hard to lift your eyes above the horizon. And maybe people may say, well, that's an unfair question. Why should I? I mean, other people don't lift their eyes above the horizon. Why should I be any different? But in this piece, I pointed out something that I brought something to mind, which is 2014. There was a off-year election, but President Obama was not on the ticket that year. And the Republicans had a dazzling win. They picked up 9 Senate seats in 2014. And they did that in a very low turnout year, the lowest turnout since the Second World War. So what was on voters, anyway, so the Republicans have this big win in 2014. They pick up 9 seats. And that enables Mitch McConnell to blockade Merrick Garland when President Obama tries to put that then judge on the Supreme Court, and to set the way for the 6-3 conservative majority that overturned abortion rights in the United States. So what was on voters' minds in 2014 when they cast the votes that struck down Roe v. Wade in 22? Was it abortion? No. I document, this is forgotten now, but an overwhelming issue in the fall of 2014 was the threat of Ebola. Which was a plague that hit West Africa, was hugely exaggerated in media, especially cable news. By the fall of 2013, a majority of Americans were afraid that they or someone they loved would get Ebola. Candidates reported on the stump. Everybody was talking about it. It was a completely fictitious threat, but it hurt the party of the president, gave the Republicans their big win, and time passed and no more abortion rights. So you may think you're voting on Ebola or inflation, but you're also casting votes that down the road are going to have results you don't anticipate. And you might want, if you care about those outcomes, to try to anticipate them now, as voters in 2014 might have wished to have thought about the abortion consequences of their vote when they were being motivated by fear, exaggerated fear of Ebola.
If our apparent lack of interest in the state of democracy these days is such, well, let's talk about the January 6th Commission. That commission, at least by my eyes, has done some pretty good work in exposing what went on January the 6th of last year. Does that suggest that most Americans are ho-hum about the whole thing?
The Republican nominee for governor of Wisconsin, who is running this year in a very close race, said just 2 days ago that if he wins, the Republicans will never lose another election in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin is the most gerrymandered state in the American North. That Republicans typically get about 45% of the vote in Wisconsin state legislature elections. They win about 65% of the seats. So that's an outcome that looks like a Hungarian result in Wisconsin, one of the heartlands and laboratories of democracy in the middle part of this century. And those are the kinds of threats that are pervasive. We have just seen an attempted a home invasion at the house of the Speaker, at the home of the Speaker of the House. Her husband was brutally assaulted. The assailant intended, if he could, to kidnap the Speaker of the House. That's the second threat of kidnapping, credible threat, on the Speaker in 2 years. The first was January the 6th. And her Republican opponents treated it like a big joke. And in fact, some of them, including President Trump, our former President Trump, are circulating wild and flagrantly false conspiracy theories that the Pelosi family brought this home invasion on themselves. It was their own fault. They deserve no sympathy. Those are the kinds of things that are warning signs that something is really awry in the state of American democracy.
It is a given that 2 years after somebody new takes over the White House, at least it's almost always a given, that their party is going to suffer in the midterm elections. And I'm just wondering if you are picking up any conditions at all that you think might make this an exception this year.
Yeah, there was a couple of months ago, there were some indications that might be true, especially the mobilization that happened among women because of the abortion decision, the Supreme Court striking down abortion rights, and a lot of state governments and stepping up and filling the vacuum with very restrictive laws. A number of Republican candidates are saying and flipping. The Republicans have always said what they wanted was to return abortion to the states. Now, many of the candidates in 2022 are saying if Republicans win, they will pass a very restrictive national abortion law, taking it away from the states now that the Supreme Court has stepped aside. There was a moment where that looked like it would be a major issue, and I don't want to say it won't be an important issue, but it doesn't look big enough to overcome the top issues in this election, which are the pain of inflation, fears of crime, and loss of control of the border, the immigration influx that is happening in the American Southwest.
I mean, because you can almost always set your watch to the fact that the party in power in the White House is going to lose seats in the ensuing midterm, can you actually point to anything the Democrats might have been able to do to countermand whatever may take place next week?
Might have been able to do in the past?
Yeah.
There are two or three things that would have made, I think, a difference. And I, by the way, I'm not just saying this now. I wrote it in March of 21. President Biden made a series of decisions in the very first weeks of his presidency that opened the border to massive border crossings. And I don't think maybe everyone in Canada is paying attention to this, but we were talking about millions of people walking across the border without authorization, showing up at bus stations, getting bus tickets, and being given court dates for hearings 2 years, 3 years, 4 years later. Court hearings they will certainly or almost certainly lose. But in the meantime, they'll be in the United States. And once they lose, they drop out of the legal system and go from being asylum seekers to being truly illegal immigrants. President Biden didn't have to make those choices. He could have maintained Trump-era border policies that would have kept the border secure. The United States labor market became very hot. It's sending out a giant help wanted signal all over the planet. And so people are coming. And if they say, if you tell me I have to be an asylum seeker to get a job in the United States, fine. I'll say I'm an asylum seeker to get a job in the United States. I'll say whatever you want me to say. You write the rules. I'm just trying to get a job. And there's no lack of sympathy to the people who are doing it. But when you have 1 million or 2 million or more people crossing the border without authorization every single year, obviously that's a giant crisis in the making. Obviously voters are going to resent it. Biden should have anticipated it and headed it off. I wrote about it in March of 21 and said it is the single biggest political mistake that he has made or will make, and that looks true to this day.
Let's pursue some more reasons why the outcome of these midterm elections matters, and we'll go through a few of the reasons here. Number one, there have been a number of Republicans who have mused about too much aid being given to Ukraine. If the Republicans take over the Senate and the House, how concerned are you that America will be less invested in the Ukraine war?
Yeah, we have to draw a sharp distinction between Republicans in the Senate and Republicans in the House. In the Senate, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell has been a staunch friend of Ukraine and a staunch supporter of traditional American foreign policy values. When Sweden and Finland applied for membership in NATO, Mitch McConnell traveled to both those countries, met with their leaders, and gave them his personal assurance that their applications would go through the Senate smoothly. And then remember, at this point, he's the minority leader, so he could sabotage it if he wanted to. And he said there will be no sabotage. Your applications are going through. And that's exactly what happened. So Mitch McConnell and all but 1 or 2 Republican senators are pretty solid on the Ukraine question. The most anti-Ukraine of the Senate candidates is, Rand Paul in Kentucky is probably the most anti-Ukraine. He's closely followed by a candidate named Blake Masters in Arizona. Masters looks likely to lose. J.D. Vance in Ohio, who has said a lot of anti-Ukraine things on the anti-Ukraine Tucker Carlson show, on the pro-Russian Tucker Carlson show. He seems to be switching his tune because he's become very dependent on McConnell for campaign funds. So I think it will be not as solid as the Democratic Senate has been, but it will be more than solid enough, and I don't think that's a big source of worry. The House is very different. There will be 30 or 40 anti-Ukraine members of the House of Representatives in the Republican caucus, by no means a majority. But unlike Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the House, Kevin McCarthy, is a very weak leader. He's afraid for his job. He's afraid of his caucus. He always splits the difference. And he's given a lot of mixed signals on the Ukraine question. So it will be more difficult to get aid through the House if more aid is needed.
Okay, a second issue. If the Republicans take over the House, does Joe Biden get impeached?
He gets entangled with a lot of investigations, but I think the thing that they are coming to do is not so much to take they're going to try to take revenge on Biden and certainly on Dr. Fauci, and they're going to try to burden Dr. Fauci in his 80s with millions of dollars of legal fees with one investigation after another, which is outrageous. He was a civil servant doing his best, but that's what will happen. They're going to be more concerned about extending political impunity to former President Trump for his many, many, many scandals and crimes, both federal and state, both public and private, and they're going to try to bury his tax returns. There has been a slow-moving case where Congress is exercising an ancient right it has had since the 1920s to get the tax returns of any person, but especially any political official that Congress asked for. That has been tangled in the courts. It's been delayed again, and if it can be delayed until the Republicans get hold of the House of Representatives, assuming they do, then those tax returns may be buried forever.
And one more on this issue of whether the Republicans take over the House, and that is, it is a frequent strategy of theirs to sort of mess around with the debt ceiling of the United States and threaten not to pay the debts. Is that a factor here again?
That is probably the single scariest thing, even scarier than what they might do to Ukraine, that is looming ahead. So the debt ceiling is, again, one of these ancient artifacts of American politics. It would be too long and boring to explain why it exists. It's dumb. Nobody else has it. I think Denmark has some equivalent, but no other modern democracy has anything like it. Everywhere else, if the legislature votes to spend the money, it is just presumed that they have voted, and they don't vote enough taxes to cover the spending. It's presumed that they have given the executive enough power to borrow to cover the difference between what the legislature voted to spend and what the legislature voted to tax. In the United States, uniquely, there's a third vote. The legislature votes to spend, the legislature votes to tax, and if there's a difference, the legislature votes to borrow. And it seems like both irresponsible and incredibly hypocritical to vote the spending, vote the taxes, and then not vote the borrowing authority if there's a difference, but that's what Congress has often done. Now, usually this is just a kind of ritual. There's a lot of posturing, a lot of speeches, scolding the executive for borrowing, pretending it's the executive that borrows and not the legislature that voted the borrowing. Lots of politicians have done it. Barack Obama did it when he was a senator. But usually there's, after the pompous and absurd speechifying, then they vote and allow the borrowing. But in recent years, this has become closer and closer. In 2011, there was a multi-day standoff about authorizing the borrowing to cover the gap. And it very nearly went wrong. No one intended to default. No one intended to default, not even the Republicans who were playing the game. They just thought they could press President Obama into yielding. But you can sometimes miscalculate when you pay as anyone who's watched the movie Grease knows, I think it's Grease where they play the game of chicken on top of the dam with the two cars racing at each other. Anyone who's ever seen that scene in a movie knows you can get it wrong and there can be an accident or somebody can go spinning off into the dam waters. Well, that nearly happened in 2011, and we have to really worry about it in 2023. And you need to understand what it means. That the United States government is the biggest purchaser of goods and services on the planet. If it loses its authority to continue to pay its obligations, that ripples through the whole world economy. You may not know that you are selling things to the United States government. You think you're selling them to some purchaser, in Canada or in the United States. But at the end of the chain of transactions is the U.S. government. And if the U.S. government doesn't pay, that ripples back to almost every supplier everywhere in the developed world, both of goods and of services. And it could be a global financial heart attack, bigger than anything seen in that financial crisis of 2008.
All right. I want to circle back to Ukraine here because I gather you just did some traveling. You were in London and Paris and Egypt. And, much of the news that we hear in Canada, because we have such a significant Ukrainian-Canadian population, is very on the side of Ukraine during the course of this war. But you were in some different places. And I wonder if there is as much backing for our efforts there as we see here. Well,
it does feel I can't speak to a general point of view, and I don't have the language, obviously, when I'm in a place like Egypt. But remember, when the war began, there were a lot of predictions of imminent global food catastrophe. And I did some reporting on the Egyptian question. Egypt is the largest purchaser of wheat in the world. Most, not every single year, but most years, the largest single purchaser of wheat. And there was a lot of predictions that Egypt and countries like it, which are low-income countries, could be exposed to shocking food shortages. And I wrote an article at the beginning of the war based on some reporting that said, actually, the Egyptians were pretty well prepared. They have a very sophisticated system of grain buying. That they're not just there with their caps out. They use complex systems of auctions all over the planet. They buy in relatively large-size units, but with frequency, and they have various kinds of income support systems to ensure that poor Egyptians, and about a third of Egyptians live on less than $4 a day, that they have some kind of cushion to continue to buy bread, which is a basic foodstuff. To my observation, that still seemed to be working. That when you pass by shops that sold bread, you didn't see enormous queues, you didn't see hungry people, you didn't see any kind of discontent at the specialized bread stores that do the income support. That said, for countries like Egypt, the way they are coping with the rise in food prices has been by borrowing much more and depending much more both on commercial borrowing and on economic aid from wealthier countries. And countries like Canada, as they think about how they're going to assist in this crisis, need to bear in mind that it's not just the Ukrainians who need direct assistance, but many food purchasers all over the world, and especially in Africa, are going to need some kind of support to get from here to there. I don't have any doubt that Ukraine is ultimately going to win and that food prices are going to return to something more like normal, and that even Russia will return someday soon to world food markets. But the next few months are going to be difficult, not apocalyptic, not beyond our ability to cope with, but difficult.
Well, let me follow up on that, because the Pew Research Center did some surveying on this question. And if we go back to March, 7% of those surveyed said that the U.S. is providing too much aid to Ukraine, only 7%. But by May, it was 12%, and last month it was 20%. How distressed are you with those numbers?
I think that reflects negative partisanship more than an actual opinion. I always think with these surveys, one of the things you would like to ask is the United States providing too much aid to Ukraine? And you watch people, 20% say yes. Approximately how much aid to Ukraine do you think the United States is producing? And I guarantee you that very few of those people could honestly answer, even approximately answer. What they are doing is instead picking up on signals from their political leaders, and especially those of them who are Republican, their Republican political leaders, that the Republicans, for a lot of reasons, are getting queasy about supporting Ukraine, and their voters then pick up on those signals. It's a real issue, but Ukraine is going, and the cost of the war is as nothing compared to what the cost of the peace is going to be, because there will be peace, and at that point, Ukraine will have to be rebuilt, and this will be the biggest rebuilding project since the end of World War II, much bigger than, for example, restoring East Germany to West Germany in the 1990s. And it's going to be pretty difficult to squeeze much in the way of reparations out of Russia, because Russia is going to end this war so poor and so much in need of whatever resources it can. And we have no interest in seeing Russians go hungry either. So the day is going to come when the war will end, and the world will be facing with whatever reparations it can get from Russia, probably a bill close to $1 trillion or more to rebuild houses, to rebuild energy sources, to recreate Ukraine as a functioning economy. It will be worth it, and the money will come back, just as the Marshall Aid money after World War II came back. This is going to be one of the largest countries in Europe. It is going to have fast economic growth once it gets peace, and it is going to contribute to the wealth and well-being of everybody. But to get from here to there, that's going to be hard.
Right. So until that happens, I note that there were large demonstrations both in Paris and in Prague demanding that sanctions against Russia be terminated. So I wonder if you could gauge for us how you feel European solidarity is these days on the issue of Ukraine.
Well, we are having some very good news on that front, which is last winter there were very high gas prices Russia prepared for this war by slowing the flow of gas from its sources into Europe in the summer and fall of 2021, creating market tightness in early 2022 and very, very high prices. But the Europeans have, and gas is not really a global commodity. You can't just get it from anywhere. It has to either flow on a pipeline or be liquefied and flow through a very sophisticated and expensive liquid natural gas terminal. But the Europeans have done a very effective job of constraining their use, of rapidly building their liquefied natural gas programs so they can get more gas from West Africa, from the United States, from other sources. And whereas a couple of months ago they were dimming the lights, now the lights are bright, and natural gas prices are surprisingly low everywhere in Europe. So whoever is fomenting those protests doesn't have a lot to work with, because the number one grievance that Europeans would have about this war, which is high energy prices, that is much less a problem today than it was 2 months ago or 6 months ago.
In our last minute, I want to go right off the board with a question a bit out of left field, and that is, I know how much you enjoy being on Twitter, and you're very good on Twitter. But there's a new owner of Twitter, and he's done some kind of crazy things in the first couple of days that he's owned it. I don't know if this is one of the crazy things, but he wants to charge people $8 a month for the blue check mark. And I want to know if you're going to be one of those people giving Elon Musk $8 a month.
Yeah, that's not really a personal question, because remember that it's not, Elon Musk thinks of the blue check mark as a snob thing, a status marker that people pay for, like a vanity license plate. It's not for the user. It's not for the person who tweets. It is for the recipient of the tweet. It's a way to judge the authority. And here's a question that is a way to think about this. There's a hurricane coming, and you're looking, and there's information on your Twitter feed about the hurricane. You want to know, can I trust that information? What you do right now is you check, is this a verified tweet from the National Weather Service, from the National Hurricane Center, from my local police department, or is it just some bozo making pranks? You might say, well, what kind of sicko would put out fake hurricane news? Well, during 2012, Hurricane Sandy, there was a sicko with a large account who did spread panic with fake hurricane news. So that check mark is your way of knowing that the hurricane news you're getting is true. You can rely on it. And the idea that Elon Musk would say, I don't care, I'm going to let the National Weather Center deliberately misspelling the word weather, buy a blue check mark and put out false hurricane news so long as I get $8 a month. That's going to be totally destructive of the information value of his own platform. So I think in the early days of Twitter, that was very hard, and there were a lot of hoaxes. More recently, that has been less of a problem. Elon Musk is in danger of making it a problem again.
One of too many questions we have about Twitter going forward. David, we're always grateful when you spare time for our program. You be well, and until next time.
Such a pleasure. Bye-bye.
With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, foreign policy everywhere has entered a new era. For Canada, that likely means a reorientation and reevaluation of how we think about security across the vast northern part of this country, the Arctic. With us to examine that reality, and we'll introduce our guests, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, beginning in Calgary, Alberta, with Rob Hubert. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. In the nation's capital, retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie. He was the Deputy Commander of the NATO Land Forces in Afghanistan, also formerly a Member of Parliament for Orleans or Orléans, depending on what part of town you're in. Here in our studio, Janice Stein, Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and former founding director of the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Adam Chapnick is here, professor in the Department of Strategic Studies at RMC, the Royal Military College, and Deputy Director of Education at the Canadian Forces College. And it is really great to have you four back on our airwaves for a timely and important conversation that I'd like to kick off by, I guess, citing something recent testimony to the Commons Defense Committee from General Wayne Eyre. That's our Chief of Defense Staff, who warned that if Russia and China were to cooperate in the Arctic, it would, quote, pose significant threats to Canada's ability to protect its sovereignty. And I want to find out from all of you how big a deal you think that is. General Leslie, start us off if you would.
It's a really big deal, Steve. It's, quite frankly, our Arctic is undefended. We have a few scattering of regular force, a couple of air bases up there, which are only occupied a couple of days of the year. We've got the Canadian Rangers, who are magnificent, but are not actually recruited, trained, or equipped to fight. We have no significant sea or airborne surveillance capabilities, such as big drones or new long-range patrol aircraft. And the Arctic patrol vessels are just getting into service, but they're certainly not capable of operating in a combat environment. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that with the Russian bear rampaging across Europe, though they're getting their buttocks handed to them by the Ukraine, and the Chinese dragon rustling its scales, we should be paying a lot more attention and putting a lot more money into defending our Arctic.
Well, we can do the first over the next half hour. I'm not sure we can do much about the last, but I'm going to ask Janice Stein the same question. How significant do you think this threat is to Canadian sovereignty?
I really agree with both General Eyre and General Wesley that we are a three-ocean country, Steve, but we
don't think about the northern one much.
We don't think enough about the northern one, and it really does matter. If we just think 10 years forward and we assume that the ice will continue to melt more or less at the same pace, the Northwest Passage will be fully open. The shipping time between Asia and Europe will be cut in half. So right now, the largest Arctic research institute in the world is where? Beijing. Beijing. Now that tells you how strategic this part of the world is. And as Andy just put it, it's our waterway, it's our territory, and we don't have adequate capabilities, never mind to engage in combat, but adequate surveillance capabilities.
Just to police our sovereignty.
To police and to know and to see what's going on.
Rob Hubert, what do you say to that?
Well, first of all, it's not a threat to our sovereignty. We have to be very clear because there's often a misuse of term here. But there is a dire, and I would say existential threat to our security. The one thing that hasn't entered into the conversation that even extends further what was said at the House of Commons Committee is no one is talking about the new nuclear reality that we have. We, of course, have Putin talking about the possible use of nuclear weapons. No one has had a close look of the American response, which was enunciated in their strategic policy that came out last week, which basically introduced a concept called integrated deterrence, which really is talking about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, why does this pertain to the Canadian Arctic? Because if we look at the bulk of the Russian forces, they are in the Arctic. Any type of a response, any containment, any fighting of a nuclear war will, by its very nature, be in the Arctic. And Canada should be playing a critical role in all of this, because to maintain ongoing deterrence, to stop the Russians and the Chinese from even thinking about this in the first place, we have to show that we know where they're coming from. And now with the new American policy, we have to show that we're able to actually engage and fight the Russians and Chinese should they take this avenue. And this is something that's not even entering into any dialogue within the Canadian context, let alone dealing with the protection of the sovereignty of the Northwest Passage.
Okay, let me do a follow-up with Adam here. And I'm going to just turn the question a little bit on its ear for you, Adam. The fragility of our Arctic border is something that has been referenced, for decades. This is not a new problem. Do you think Canada's Foreign Affairs establishment has adequately had its attention paid to this problem?
I think that we, generally speaking, in Canada and foreign policy, take our time with these things. Sometimes it's to our benefit. Sometimes these problems go away for whatever reason. Sometimes they don't. When they don't, it's more to our detriment. I think one of the benefits, actually, of slow walking this one is that I'm not sure, I understand the security threat that my colleagues are talking about. I'm much more concerned about an economic threat, and that I don't find Russia and China to be equal partners. I find that Russia is not proving itself to be particularly powerful in that partnership right now, and the Chinese have a much greater interest in economics. And it's the Chinese economic interest in the Arctic. If they can leverage Russia as a weaker partner, that would make me concerned, because Russia has most of the Arctic to itself. If that becomes Chinese Arctic, then there is no way to keep the Chinese from shaping the global governance regime around Arctic security and the environment up there.
Janice, I'm going to put another quote to you, because the new French ambassador to Canada apparently gave an interview in the National Post, said, quote, "Canada is now confronted with a situation where NORAD looks like an old Volvo 240. I mean, it's strong, but you have to beef it up." That's what he said. In your view, is the situation that dire to make a new ambassador that blunt in one of his first interviews?
I have to say that was a singular comment by a French ambassador. on Canadian soil. But actually, I think that one is a little over the top, largely, Steve, because we do have a roadmap for updating NORAD. There's good track laid between the United States and Canada, and we've slow walked it, but we're gonna get it done. I'm more concerned about the Arctic because we don't have really a roadmap. And I don't think the real issue here is the use of nuclear weapons in the Arctic or even direct combat between us and the Russians. I do think there are huge economic interests in the Arctic. And if we can't survey, patrol, know, which is the responsibility of any sovereign government over its territory, and do that at speed and at scale, we are putting our own interests at work.
Andrew, Leslie, I've heard this expression now, we're slow walking this problem a couple of times, and I just want to ask you about that because we are sitting here in Toronto in the William G. Davis studio, named after the former premier, whose operating philosophy was never put off until tomorrow, what you can avoid doing altogether. I'm being a little facetious, but he got criticized for that over the years. But it was also his experience that a lot of problems went away if you didn't overreact too quickly. Is there something to be said for that here?
No, not in the slightest, and I'll tell you why. A whole bunch of folk declared a peace dividend a couple of decades ago, been coasting on that, introducing a variety of very expensive social programs, and well done to them if they can afford to do so, while maintaining a certain minimum degree of deterrence against potential enemies. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he took a look around, and he figured for his own sociopathic reasons that this was the time to go. Well, let's not kid ourselves. He went because he thought he could win. And the reason why he thought he could win is that NATO was not ready with conventional forces to actually deter in sufficient strength, which would cause him to hesitate, pause, and then reconsider. And by the way, he still keeps coming, even though actually he's doing a little bit more running away than attacking right now. Same is true of the Arctic. And with all due respect, I disagree with the assertion that this is not a question of sovereignty. Why? Because China is building more icebreakers than we can dream about.
All right.
And where are they going to operate? Well, it's logical to assume they're going to be operating in the Arctic, which, by the way, is split between really two nations, Russia and Canada. Yes, there are others involved, certainly in smaller numbers. But if we don't patrol, if we don't, as Janice mentioned, have resources to look and to feel and to get a better understanding of what's there so we can respond, either in a police role or some other, then we'll start to lose our sovereignty.
All right, let me get Rob Hubert to comment on that, because you said this was less about sovereignty and more about security. Seems General Leslie does not concur. What do you say?
Well, the problem is, of course, is when we talk about sovereignty, what we're talking about is the ability to actually have others acknowledge that these are Canadian waters. Nobody questions in terms of the land. So there's not a sovereignty issue over the land. It's over whether or not we allow ships to come into the Northwest Passage. Now, we can get into all sorts of discussion, but ultimately the essence of what General Leslie is saying is that we need to have that ability to control against those such as China that are coming in or near to these waters. That, in my view, is, of course, a security requirement. And in other words, whether or not we give the Zulong permission to go through the Northwest Passage, as we did in 2017, isn't as important as whether or not we have the underwater listening capabilities for when they start sending submarines in or near the waters. And that's, of course, a security threat, in my view. And that's really, once again, going back to your question, are we prepared? Remember in the June announcement, when we're talking about NORAD modernization, there was absolutely no mention of underwater detection systems, no mention on what we're doing with the Russian new autonomous underwater vehicles, let alone what we expect from the Chinese in the future. And I agree with the General on that point, that the security part is completely lacking from the Canadian side.
All right, you mentioned underwater, and I want to go to you, Adam, on that. Wayne Eyre, Chief of Defence Staff, also asked for more dollars to enhance Canada's, quote, underwater presence at the Arctic and a greater capacity to move troops. So give us a sense about what that actually looks like.
I think one of the challenges, before you even think about what it looks like, is whether we have the capacity to use that money if we got it right now. So even before we get to the question, we're reconstituting the Canadian Armed Forces. We have all sorts of challenges there. So in some ways, I think the Chief of the Defence Staff is putting down a marker that we're going to need to do this. It's not a matter of we're going to do it yet, but we're going to need to do this, and we need the government to commit to doing this so that once we have the capability to start doing these things, the money will be there for it.
Because we don't have the people for it today.
Don't have the people to do a lot of things right now.
Jess.
You know, I think it's interesting because I agree with Adam, but I think there's two big pieces of the story that we're missing here. The first is that our civilian sector is state-of-the-art capable in underwater sensing. We have an oceans cluster on the Atlantic coast in this country that is frankly the envy of many around the world and does incredible stuff in sensing. So I think one of the ways we have to start thinking about this is not necessarily only as a military problem, but as there's opportunities for collaboration here with civilian companies that are pioneering in technology. I think we're missing the boat on that one. The second big piece when we talk about what we know, what we see, is the role of our Indigenous leaders. There is a circumpolar conference that operates. We are going to get this wrong again. I can't say it more bluntly than that. We're going to get this wrong again.
Get what wrong?
We're going to get defense and security in the Arctic wrong unless we have partnerships with Indigenous peoples who live in that part of the world, know it, live on it, and understand the land in ways that nobody who doesn't live in the far north does.
And are they thinking about that right now?
Not enough.
Not enough. Okay. General Leslie, I want to come back to this notion that we can't even begin to think about how to spend additional dollars on things that we've been talking about until we fill 10,000 empty positions, which is currently the problem with the Canadian Armed Forces, in addition to, I think, the highest attrition rate in 15 years. Why is all that happening right now?
Very often a simple explanation can be found by following the money. So since the Liberal government came to power, they have unspent, reprofiled, not spent, carried forward, delayed, whatever bureaucratic nonsense term you want to apply to it, $15 billion that was meant for defense procurement, promised for defense procurement, but couldn't be got out the door. And the reason why they couldn't get it out the door, in other words, the reason why they couldn't buy equipment, is the bureaucracy were responding to their political leaders, and essentially it was go slow. That's why this year alone, D&D handed back in $3 billion. By the way, if you understand by $2 to $3 billion out of your theoretical allocation every year, guess what 10,000 people cost you per year? About 1.4, 1.5 billion. So if D&D doesn't have the money to take them in and to train them and equip them, they can't recruit them. And that's what's happening. So there's a relatively simple explanation. And my plea to the government of Canada would be, get off your derrieres, start spending the money more quickly and more efficiently than you've ever done in the past over the previous 7 years, because whatever you're doing is not working. Our warship contract is now a couple of decades should have been signed. Same is true of the new fighters. Same is true of a whole host of equipment capabilities and training and recruiting efforts. So, get rid of the gatekeepers and start getting on with it, quite frankly.
We've heard that expression before. Okay. Rob, let me go to you on this one. And that is, China's 1 billion people. Russia's over 100 million people. We're a long way behind. Do we simply have too small a population to think seriously about patrolling, expressing our sovereignty this far away from the major centers of the country?
No, we don't. I mean, it's, getting what all three of my co-panelists are saying, it's a lack of political will. And the part of the conversation we haven't had, and I mean, just to pile on this inability to buy, we have said we are going to be building a big icebreaker, basically to replace the Louis Saint Laurent. We made that decision back on September 10th, 1985, that we were going to do it. What year is it now? And do we have a big icebreaker? And so, a pox on both the Liberals and the Conservatives in this regards. But let's look at and this is where I can push back a little bit on Janice saying that there's not a threat. Have a look at what the Nordic countries have been doing in terms of their ability, because they recognized the threat when the Russian invasion actually began, which is 2014. Of course, in Canada, we call it an illegal occupation, which is BS. I mean, it was a military invasion, full stop. It's another different word that we don't want to engage. But you have a look at the Finns, you have a look at the Danes. They were both able to make the decision, change. For the Danes, it was a 180-degree change to buy the F-35. So they go through the process as, okay, we've changed our mind because of the new threat. We're going to go for the F-35s, and they've done it. The Finns, 2.5 years also to do it. The Norwegians are now allowing American attack nuclear-powered subs not only to come into their ports, but they're also allowing them to be serviced in the port. And we see a Nordic branch of NATO that is very comparable to NORAD in terms of the shared aerospace. They've all signed very close operation signs with the Americans. They're engaging in the Americans to prepare for this extended deterrence, which means how do we fight in the north? And Canada, of course, is totally lacking. And to get to the heart of your question, if the Norwegians, Danes, Finns, Icelanders can figure out how to do this since the war started in 2014, and we're still sitting here having this conversation in 2022, I mean, it's just simply a lack of political will. And,
Okay,
and I can't think of anything else.
Let Janice wants in on you.
Well, look, I don't think that the principal threat to the Arctic is a Russian invasion of the Canadian Arctic or a Russian attack. Well, we disagree on that. And frankly, tragically, what's happened to the Russian military over the last 6 months has probably made it less likely, not more likely. This is a shattered, fractured army that is going to take a decade to rebuild in Russia if there's decent leadership, and I don't see any prospect of that. So I don't think that's the right frame, and the reason I say it that way is I don't think we will buy the right assets if that's what we focus on. I think the issue is it is the epicenter of a strategic waterway that is going to change shipping patterns. We do not have the capacity to see what they are going to do underwater. It is the surveillance, patrol, and sensing capacity that, to me, is we can't do anything. Rob and I can have this argument for another 10 years, but we don't know what's happening underwater. It doesn't matter because we won't have a capacity to respond.
It's part of, or sorry.
Go ahead, please. Yes.
Sorry, it's also part of a larger picture. And I would submit to you that the current government, certainly, the one I can speak about most because I was a member of it for a time, are essentially pacifist in nature. They don't believe in defense spending. And I think sort of subconsciously and perhaps not so subconsciously, they're willing to fight to the last American in terms of the friendships and the allies that we've got who are willing to go overseas and do stuff. Am I suggesting that Canada is a great power and should spend accordingly? No, of course not. But we have to do a proportional share. Yeah. And so when you have the Secretary General of NATO who visits here less than a month ago and says, by the way, NATO has to do more to defend the Arctic, pointing right up north. Yeah, that's a pretty pointed message. When the United Kingdom Chief of Defense Staff says, hey, by the way, if you guys want help, I can send a couple of submarines up there to patrol under the ice for you and maybe show your soldiers how to use the Arctic terrain to better advantage. Ouch.
Adam,
so I'll stop there.
Okay, well, Andrew Leslie has sort of pointed to one of the typical things one hears about Canadian defense policy, which is basically, if we're in trouble, we call Washington. We've been doing too much of that?
I think that it makes sense to leverage the most powerful country in the world with whom you have an excellent relationship whenever you can. If you can allow yourself to spend less on security and more on other things, I don't see why that's a bad idea. Now, pushing it too far to the point that the Americans take you for granted is a bigger problem. But the basic idea that we recognize that we have the best ally we could possibly imagine and that we're going to leverage what they give to us, I don't see a problem with that. The problem is taking it for granted. So I think there are two different things here.
Rob, you want to take that on?
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to see what the future is coming, remember that it was under the Trump administration pump, and particularly the Secretary of State at an Art Council meeting, where he specifically says that the Canadian claim to the Northwest Passage is problematic to the U.S. And we think that the only reason why the Americans under Trump did not launch a freedom of navigation voyage through the Northwest Passage that would have broken up the 1988 agreement that we've had with the Americans that has worked very well is the fact that they didn't have any ships because one of their icebreakers had an engine fire. And I think that was the only thing that saved us from having a direct challenge. And if we look at the American system right now, we have a very possible re-election of Trump or a Trump-like individual who says that NATO is not doing enough as it is, and NATO is spending a lot more than Canada is spending in terms of either NORAD or NATO. I think that those that say that we can ultimately depend on the United States, that the United States will always have our back, they see us as something different. I think that they're living in the past. I think we have a new United States, and I think this whole issue about depending on them is going to go out the window come the next presidential election.
You know, Steve, just let me quickly go back to something that Andy Leslie just said. You know, NATO faces serious challenges in Europe. And there is a rationalization of effort where everybody does what's closest and what they can do best. So I think you're right to point to the fact that the Brits said to us, what are you doing up there? Do you know what's going on underwater? We don't have an answer to that question. And frankly, the United States, which finds itself right now stretched to the point where there are available stockpiles are diminishing at an enormously rapid rate because they didn't anticipate the kind of challenge they're facing in Ukraine either. They're saying to us, will you look after the Arctic?
Well,
now, that makes a lot of sense, but we have to do it.
Here's why, maybe. I'm going to put some numbers out here, and then General Leslie, I'd like to hear you on this. Since February 2022, this is the invasion of Ukraine, Canada has provided $600 million of military assistance to Ukraine. In that same period of time, the United States, $17 billion. Now, you know, when you consider that they're 10 times bigger, we're nowhere close to being within a factor of 10 of the contribution the U.S. is making. So I asked the question, General Leslie, is Canada doing enough?
If you look at the dollar value, actually $600 million is not bad at all. But if you look at the military assistance for a nation which has its back to the wall and is desperately struggling and fighting and clawing their way through Russian offensives, and now on an offensive of their own, they need combat capability. So Canada has essentially been writing checks. Okay, fine. But in terms of contribution of combat systems, we've sent really 4 now aging howitzers, 10 barrels. Most of those have been shot out, so they've got to be replaced. And really, that's it. They've asked for a whole host of other stuff, which we've not been able to provide because our own stocks here in Canada are so minimalist. We don't have any air defense system right now, either low level, medium, or high altitude, zero. By the way, there's a whole bunch of distinguished academics on the panel. I challenge you to find any other nation in the world which has no air defense system. Go ahead. So we don't have any anti-tank system. We don't, and at least not handheld. And there's a whole myriad of other skill sets and capabilities that we're missing, or which we might have been able to provide if we had them. So we have to do more. We have to be seen to be doing more because we're part of a coalition of the willing. We believe in what the Ukraine's doing. We recognize the dangers of Russia and the looming threat of China, mainly to our Arctic in our context. And I've yet to see any energy or any leadership at the strategic level saying, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it fairly quickly. We rearmed quite quickly at the height of the Afghan war. In comparison to what's going on right now, Afghanistan was a relatively minor affair, though we paid our fair share, more than that, in blood and treasure. It's time we stepped up to the plate and actually stopped talking about it and start doing it, starting with the Arctic.
Just a few minutes to go. And Adam, do you agree that it's time to step up to the plate for this country?
I would love to see this government spend more on defense. I don't think the public is asking them to. I think that in that context, it makes it a lot harder. I think writing checks is the easiest and the most logical thing to do when there isn't public pressure. I do want to add, though, that we should put some dollar value to refugees that are coming here, that is a contribution this country is making that other countries would struggle to make in the same way because our system is more effective. So we're not completely ignoring the situation, and I think the government is acting prudently. Would I like to see it act more boldly? Yeah, probably, but I can understand prudence in the political context in which we operate here.
Apropos of the gatekeeper comment we heard earlier, do we have any reason to believe, Janice, that if Pierre Poilievre wins the next election and the Conservatives take over the government, that things will improve on this file?
Well, again, we've all talked about some of the institutional obstacles to procurement. A pox on both houses. Procurement is a long, unending, enduring, miserable story in this country and proceeds at a snail's pace. I don't even think it's political will. I think it's something more insidious, in all honesty, which is the fear of making a mistake. But I think the Accountability Act is the worst thing that ever happened to this country because it paralyzed our civil service. And if you make a mistake, you're on the front page of the Globe, and you get one clause in that contract wrong, and there are allegations of corruption or inefficiency. And it's just a huge issue inside that the process requirements around procurement are probably some of the thickest of any country in the world. When you talk about whether we should be doing more, Steve, it's important also to look at the economic assistance that we're given. Ukraine is in the fight for its life, frankly, but its economy is virtually bankrupt. It's not only Zelensky, it's others who are really looking at what it will take Ukraine to sustain its economy, recover $50 billion. We are giving economic assistance at a higher rate than almost any of our peers. As Adam says, that probably makes sense because we don't have stockpiled stuff to give. And in an emergency, that's what we're doing.
Okay, let me get Rob in here in our last minute here. If we look back when Stephen Harper was in power, is there anything about the way the Conservatives then did business which might lead you to believe that if Pierre Poilievre becomes the next prime minister, things will improve?
Modernization of the frigates and the C-17s. If there's the political will, we can do it. The frigates were modernized under expense, and it was done under schedule. And the C-17, which everybody agrees is a major contribution to the Canadian capability today, was also done. So I don't accept that there's other institutional elements. If the political leadership says this shall be done, we've seen the two cases where it was done. And once again, to take General Ayres' point, the Chinese, when they invade Taiwan and the Americans completely change their strategic position, Canada's going to be faced with a reality that is going to be very uncomfortable for it. And I think that the more that we can prepare for it, the less that the damage to both our relationships and our economic relationships will be there.
That's Rob Hubert from the University of Calgary. My thanks as well to General Andrew Leslie, who came to us from the nation's capital. Here in the studio, Janice Stein from the Monk School, Adam Chapnick from RMC. It's really great having you four on our airwaves tonight to go into what is a complicated and difficult issue. But I got to think that we're all a little smarter right now, thanks to the four of you being here. So much appreciated.
Thanks, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022. Tomorrow, we'll look across the pond at what's roiling British politics. Also, a conversation with Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz about his hope for bringing the economy back. He calls it progressive capitalism. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.